is what I'm saying as I say it, which is slightly hilarious. So I will just click that off. Okay, right. So just to introduce PAS, the Planning Advisory Service, who we are. So I'm Becky Moberly, and I'm leading a project, a Defra funded project, helping local authorities get ready for biodiversity net gain when it becomes mandatory in November 2023. I've also got Gareth Brough on the call, who is helping with that project. So I work 4 days a week and he's 1 day a week on that project to make up to 1 FTE. We've actually got a few other folk from PAS in the room today. We've got some people who do some work on nutrient neutrality and our sort of wider environmental planning work, and that's really reflected in the fact that these conservation covenants are very much not just about biodiversity net gain. They offer all sorts of benefits. So we've got Roy Hymas, Rachel Jones and Richard Crawley also in the room. And just to say, in terms of who the Planning Advisory Service are, if you've not come across us, most of our programme, in fact, all of our programme, apart from this Biodiversity Net Gain project, is funded by DLUC, the Department for Levelling Up. We have a wide-ranging programme basically helping local authorities with planning issues, and that can be the current planning system, but also future changes to the planning system, of which there are going to be quite a lot coming up, as we know, with the LURB, or Levelling Up Bill out. So we have a range of things on our programme for this year, including some engagement around the new bill, but also town centres work, helping with local plans, development management designations, design codes, all sorts of things. So do have a look at our website if you're interested in any of those other bits. Right, and aside from PAS, we've got Defra and Natural England folk in the room. So we've got Freya Dixon Van Dyke, who's the Conservation Covenant and Biodiversity Targets lead at Defra. We've got John Stratton, who works with Freya and is a Conservation Covenants Policy Advisor. We've got Tim Andrews from the Nature Strategy team at Defra. Tom Reynolds from the Net Gain, who's the Net Gain Register Policy Lead at Defra. And we've also got Graham Kerr from Natural England, and he's a specialist in conservation covenants and greener growth. So you'll be hearing from all of those as we go on. And I'm just going to run through what we're going to do today. So we're going to give a quick intro, just to run a couple of polls to understand what you know already about conservation covenants. And then Freya and Tom are going to, sorry, it says Tim up there, but it's actually going to be Tom Reynolds who's going to give a bit of an overview of conservation covenants, what they are, how they'll work, and in particular, the roles that are available to local authorities in relation to conservation covenants. And then Graham Kerr is going to be talking a bit about Natural England's perspective and what they're thinking in preparing to be a responsible body. And then we've got loads of time for questions. So put your questions in as we go along. We may pick those up during the presentations, but we've got loads of time for that. And then we'll have a quick summing up, sort of just talk about next steps and get a bit of feedback from you. We will definitely finish by 12 o'clock. We ran the same event on Tuesday and we finished about 10 to 12, but we'll see. We want to answer as many questions as we can, obviously. Just to say, really, that I know a lot of you are coming from interest in biodiversity net gain, because that's sort of where we've got a lot of our contacts from the project. But what I learned on Tuesday is just how flexible and what a wide range of possible uses there are for conservation covenants beyond biodiversity net gain, which is really interesting. So just bear that in mind as we go through, and I'm sure the presenters will highlight that as well. Okay, so we're just going to ping up a couple of polls. Those should come up in your, they should pop up, or if you can't see them pop up, just open up the chat, which should be at the top of your screen, and that should show the poll. So we're interested in what your current awareness and understanding of conservation covenants is. So from 1 to a little to no awareness to 5 excellent understanding. And I think we've got another poll just to really understand why you've joined today. So is that because your local authority is thinking of becoming a responsible body? Is it because you're thinking of using conservation covenants perhaps in a different way? or just because you want to find out more, you don't really know what those roles are, but you just want to find out a bit more information. I suspect it may well be a lot of the latter, given we've got some results there in terms of, and most people are sort of on the 1 and 2s, a little bit of 3s around what you know. So, okay, so I'll just leave those running for a little bit. And I've got my multiple screens going up, so I'm just having a look over here. Yeah, brilliant. So it's very similar, actually. As I said, we ran an event on Tuesday, so very similarly, we had a lot of people who were sort of little to no awareness, not really sure what they're about, and very few people in that sort of, you know, a lot of understanding. So that's hopefully today will be really useful in terms of finding out more. And again, just in terms of that, you know, a few people thinking about becoming a responsible body or using conservation covenants as a landowner, but a lot of you here just to find out more. So please do, yeah, continue to bung in your responses to those. Okay, I'll just leave that up for 30 more seconds. Okay, great. Right. Okay, thanks very much for responding to those. And just a quick reminder for anybody who joined a bit late, we're running questions through the chat, but if you are happy to ask your own question, I will be bringing people in to ask your own question. Just bear in mind that this recording will be shared on our website. So if you don't want to have your face potentially appear, or your name or your voice appear on a recording, then just bear that in mind, and you can put a little note next to your question that you don't want to, you know, and I can ask the question myself. So I think we might want to do that poll at the end as well, Gareth. And
yeah, apologies, I've closed that poll. Sorry, I didn't mean to open that.
No, that's all right. We're learning how to use Teams, so we'll bring that one back up. I see that somebody said in the chat that they would answer 2 options, but it only allows for 1. Thanks, Tamara. If you want to just put in the chat what options you might. I thought I'd allowed it to allow for 1, but it seems that it's not done that. So apologies for that. Please do put in the chat if you're interested in more than one of those. Okay, brilliant. Right, I'm going to hand over to Freya to give a bit of an overview of conservation covenants. Freya from Defra.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much. So I've got control now. So yeah, I'm Freya Dixon-Van Dyke. So I work as the policy lead on conservation covenants at Defra. We work really closely with teams, including the BNG teams and Natural England, both of which are here today, which is excellent. And also more widely with teams like nutrient neutrality, like the ELM schemes as well. So yeah, quite a broad area. So I'll just come in straight off from a perspective of why do we think we actually need conservation covenants? Why are we bringing these in? So at present, we think that conservation opportunities in England are being missed because of some of the systems that we have to enable conservation to happen. We've got some costly, some complex workarounds which are currently required if you want to take conservation action on private land due to some current systems. So a couple of examples below. If you want to designate a land and protect it in that way, your site has to be of a specific quality, and each designation must be approved by government. So you've got this natural kind of bottleneck there. Property law currently doesn't allow for the attachment of positive obligations to land. For example, you might get some land on which you're unable to cut down an ancient tree which is growing by a house, but you can't currently attach positive obligations such as you must, plant and conserve the woodlands involved. Sorry, I just got a message in the chat. Oh no, fine. We'll come on to those in a bit. And things like contract law only bind the land's current owner to an agreement. So obviously we can tell that in government we're thinking a lot about more long-term conservation, more long-term action for nature at the moment. So actions which go beyond generations, beyond land's current owners. So there's a need for a tool which actually accommodates that as well. as at present, we're looking at some suboptimal conservation economic impacts when we're stuck in quite short cycles of action. So what is a conservation covenant? So conservation covenant, as laid out in the Environment Act, is a private, legally binding and voluntary agreement between a landowner or a long-term leaseholder, so that's 7 years or more, and a designated responsible body. And we'll come on to a bit more detail on responsible bodies as well in a bit. So conservation covenants are agreements which can legally be made from the 30th of September, although to note, as it requires a responsible body to be in place for that agreement, first you'd have to have your responsible bodies register. So in practice, we'd be looking at the first kind of agreements really coming into action towards the end of this year or early next year. That's the sort of timeline we're working with. So conservation covenant can actually be used for the conservation of nature or heritage sites. So for example, historic environment on a piece of land, and it also must be for the public good. And one common misunderstanding is that these have to be in perpetuity or over extremely long time periods. And that certainly is one of the benefits of conservation covenants, in that if you want to, if you don't specify a time period, it will default to in perpetuity. But you're also very welcome to set a time period. It could be 5 years, it could be 10 years. In practice, we'd expect most agreements to be longer than that. So for example, for the purposes of biodiversity net gain, we'd be looking at over 30 years. And then for the purposes of something like nutrient neutrality, it might be more like 80, 100 or longer. And as I mentioned, one thing that's also new with conservation covenants is that they're capable of binding future owners of the land because they're transferred with the land at a point of sale or at a point of purchase, and when you or inheritance. And when you receive that land and you purchase that land or get it through other means, you're also accepting the obligations or the duties that come with it as part of the conservation covenant. And so to facilitate that, conservation covenants must be registered as a local land charge and are generally monitored and enforced by both parties. So that's the responsible body and the landowner or long-term leaseholder. Once they're set up, they can absolutely be discharged, they can be modified, they can be transferred to another responsible body, as long as there's mutual agreement between the signatories of that contract. And to note as well, those signatories could be multiple. If you wanted, you could have multiple landowners or multiple responsible bodies, or in fact both, all signing on the same contract. But the important thing is it must include at least one responsible body and the landowner or landowners for which that agreement refers to. So we've also got an annual reporting requirement, which will be the responsibility of the responsible body. So fairly basic, but we'll want to understand each year from responsible bodies. We'll say, you know, how many conservation covenants do you have? What kind of purposes are they for? Are they for nature conservation, heritage conservation? Are they for biodiversity net gain or nutrient neutrality specifically? And what kind of land are they on? And all that will be really useful for feeding into things like our habitats targets and understanding where we're making progress. And just for a little bit of context, how did we come to this solution? Why do we think it's something that's necessary? The concept behind conservation covenants comes from a 2014 Law Commission report recommendation. And similar agreements, although not exactly the same, are already used in places including Australia, the US and Scotland. Although you might find there are some differences in terms of the way the Scottish system works, so it isn't a direct parallel. So who can be a responsible body? Prospective organisations will have to apply to become responsible bodies. We won't be doing any automatic designation, even of things like local authorities, which is something that they do in Scotland. So in order to become a responsible body, that organisation must satisfy the Secretary of State that at least some of their main functions, purposes or activities relate to conservation. We'll also note there will be an exemption for local authorities there. They won't have to demonstrate that kind of core purpose, as we understand. It's very important in the planning process. So these applications will be assessed against criteria which we'll publish, and then I'll include questions on things like financial capability to enter into these long-term conservation agreements, questions like, do you have the technical expertise, or do you have access to that technical ecological expertise that you'll need to make sure you're conserving land or restoring it in an appropriate way? And also on motivation for applying, what are you intending to do with these conservation covenants if you're approved as a responsible body? And so we're currently finalising that criteria and guidance at the moment. So possible uses of conservation covenants. One thing to hammer home here is, I know we've got a lot of interest, of course, from the biodiversity net gain perspective, and conservation covenants will be the main mechanism of delivering off-site biodiversity net gain going forwards. But there will also be a lot of other functions that you could use this for. So, for example, landscape recovery, so large-scale conservation projects, restoration projects, rewilding. You might also have private agreements. You might simply have altruistic landowners who want to make sure that the land belonged to their family for generations is treated in the way that they want it to be treated. And of course, that could apply, all of those could apply to heritage sector actions as well. So it's quite possible that local authorities could be getting involved from that perspective. Although to note, it's generally conservation covenants offer conservation for nature. That could also include like restoration support. For heritage sector, slightly different. Obviously, restoration is kind of its appropriateness kind of must be considered on a case-by-case basis. So likewise, in that kind of technical expertise demonstration, we'd expect responsible bodies to be taking responsible, appropriate action, and, for example, not incorrectly trying to use a conservation covenant to restore something that shouldn't be restored. Another way which they could be used is as an alternative to land purchase by some conservation organisations. Because at present we have, especially with kind of ecological brokerage organisations, sometimes we have slightly complex setups where someone purchases the land and then leases it for a very small sum to another organisation so that they're allowed to then use that organisation to enter into other agreements. So conservation covenants definitely aren't intended to make anything more complex than it already is. They're a very flexible tool, and I think, as people like Graham will be coming on to, a lot of the actions which we might be delivering through conservation covenants in future, we'd expect a lot of those to be things that are going on anyway through kind of other contracts, other ways of working. This is just a legal tool that could be a way of bringing those agreements together. So how will local authorities be involved? Local authorities could be involved either as a landowner or as a designated responsible body. So you'd need to apply if you want to be a responsible body. You could be fairly confident you will be designated by the Secretary of State, by Defra. And of course, any land which is already owned, or in fact a long-term leasehold, by that local authority could also be entered into a conservation covenant. But one important thing to know would be that you're not able to enter into a legal agreement with yourself. So it wouldn't be possible for you to be both the landowner and the responsible body in any given agreement. You'd have to pick an organisation such as Natural England if you wanted to be the landowner and work with them on that. So conservation covenants could be really valuable for ensuring compensatory habitats are maintained in the long term. Things like biodiversity net gain, nutrient neutrality, long-term nature and heritage specific work. And I'm just going to pass to Tom for this slide, who's going to talk you through a little bit more about the specifics of biodiversity net gain for conservation covenants.
Thanks, Freya. Hi, everyone. Yeah, just one slide from me here to touch on biodiversity net gain. So there are two options for securing off-site biodiversity gain sites, and those are conservation covenants, and there is planning obligations. We've heard of lots of uses for conservation covenants, but where they are used for biodiversity net gain, there are some additional requirements. So, for example, the Environment Act sets out that biodiversity gain sites need to be secured for a minimum of 30 years. Conservation covenants in general, it's sort of 7 years and up as a landowner, but it could be for shorter or for any length of time. But for biodiversity net gain, it's at least 30 years. And there'll be some other requirements as well that come into that for conservation covenants for BNG purposes. And those will need to be met before a site can be registered. So having a legally secured by planning obligation or conservation covenant gain site is a prerequisite to registering that gain site on the National Biodiversity Gain Sites Register. And so in applying to register a gain site, the register operator will need a copy of that agreement because they need to check that, for example, it has a minimum duration of at least 30 years and the other requirements are met as well as part of that covenant. So that's very, very briefly the relationship between conservation covenants and biodiversity net gain, where they come in the process. They can also be used for securing on-site as well, but we think one of the main uses really is for securing off-site, because planning conditions can be used to secure on-site gains, but not off-site, and they might be simpler. Yeah, thanks. That's it from me.
Amazing, thanks, Tom. So yeah, mentioned it already, but lots of interactions going on with other initiatives. And I know we're generally answering questions at the end and more pop up, but I did spot one about, can a charity be a responsible body? And absolutely yes, a charity can be a responsible body. So we don't actually limit the kind of organisations that can be relevant. So you could be a public sector organisation, a private sector organisation, or some kind of public authority, and all of those could be eligible to apply to be a responsible body, as long as you meet those kind of conservation, expertise, financial criteria that we laid out before. So in practice, we probably expect quite a lot of charities actually to be looking at being responsible bodies. But we also accept that kind of with increasing private interest as well in things like landscape restoration, and we might also have a growing number of private organisations who do have that expertise looking to become involved, and conservation covenants being part of their business model. And I guess it's something we can come into more kind of in the conversations and in the chat as well. Obviously, these are legal contracts that two entities, the landowner and the responsible body, sign. And people won't enter into these agreements unless there is kind of an advantage for them of doing so. So these contracts could involve a transfer of money, in fact, in either direction between the landowner and the responsible body. But often we would expect that perhaps the landowner might be paid by the responsible body to undertake particular actions, or in fact that if a landowner simply wants to conserve and enhance that action on that land, they could give some kind of charge, some kind of funds to the responsible body in return for that organisation's expertise and advice. So yeah, it can be structured in a range of ways to support that. In terms of next steps, we expect to publish our main conservation covenant guidance around July. So I'll be outlining kind of the basics. What are they exactly? How are they going to work beyond that, which is already laid out in legislation? And then we'll be publishing further guidance on actually the process of applying to be a responsible body, the process of registering CONCOVs as a local land charge, and those annual reporting requirements I mentioned in the lead up to implementation, which is, just to come back to that, the 30th of September. So the first agreements are likely to be in place within 2 to 4 months following this date, as I mentioned, although that does depend on kind of the pace of uptake, what kind of applications we're getting, and of course how quickly those private legal agreements proceed, which government doesn't have any direct involvement in, of course. So yeah, absolutely available for questions, but I will pass back to Becky to coordinate.
Lovely, thanks Freya. Okay, so that's great, and as Freya said, we'll have the Q&As at the end of the session after Graham's presentation, so please do keep the questions coming. That email address is just there if you come up with any questions after the session, and yeah, Defra will be happy to pick those up as well. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Graham Kerr from Natural England. Graham, are you all right to take control of the presentation?
Okay, thanks Becky. I think I've taken control now.
Okay. That's it, lovely.
Okay, brilliant. I'm Graham Kerr. I lead on conservation covenants in Natural England. I've worked on conservation covenants for about 5 years now. Natural England's probably considered conservation covenants for longer than that, since Law Commission initial proposal. So we've done quite a lot of thinking over that period of time. And what I thought would be of interest to you is to share some of the work that we've done in preparing to become a responsible body. Natural England has already taken the decision that we want to be a responsible body, so we've now started thinking about what processes we need to put in place. And I thought that many local authorities are likely to want to apply to become a responsible body, so I'm happy to share that work. If any of you have got any questions, happy to be contacted, either questions asked in the chat at the end of this session, or to be contacted after the session. More than happy to engage with any of you. One point that I need to stress is that apart from the next slide, everything that I say and everything on the slides is basically my informed view. It's not, Natural England hasn't taken decisions on it. Still think that's helpful. So let's carry on. Okay, this is what Natural England's decided. In July last year, we took the decision that Natural England wanted to become a responsible body. We wanted to do so at the earliest opportunity, and our board gave a steer that we should use conservation covenants to support the delivery of our nature recovery strategy. So we don't intend to sort of set up a programme for securing conservation covenants or anything like that. Conservation covenants will be very much an addition to our toolbox to help us do what we already do better. So when I talk about the processes that we have to set up, at times it looks horrendous, looks like a lot has to be done, but you have to remember that we probably do those anyway using a range of other tools. And what we hope happens is that we are able to deliver the outcomes that we want to achieve more effectively. So we get a better result for the resources that we're able to put into sort of our outcomes that we're trying to secure. I thought it'd be helpful to sort of outline what timescales we're working to. I think the important thing is that if we want to become a responsible body, we need to be ready, all our policies, processes in place, so that we can say yes or no to an applicant from day one. And we've got to be able to respond to an applicant in a reasonable, fair and rational way. We've already actually had landowners approaching us. When the Act got passed, many people assumed that conservation covenants were now available, so people have already come to us. It doesn't start until the 30th of September, as Freya's already said. So our assumption is that we could become a responsible body on any day after the 30th of September. So that means our deadlines are everything will be in place in terms of policies, procedures, processes from that date. So what do we have to do at the moment? We've got to take conservation covenants through our business planning process, and we have to establish those processes, procedures, so that we can operationalise conservation covenants within our delivery teams. I don't want to say too much about our business planning process, but I started taking that through our systems last year, and a couple of things sort of came up which I'll share with you because they'll probably be of interest. One concerned resources. Conservation covenants is a new tool. Therefore, one of the questions that people tended to ask was, okay, new tool, that means we need to have new resources. Where are they going to come from? Now, once the board took the decision that we were going to be using conservation covenants to deliver our nature recovery strategy, in a sense that answered it. We're not doing additional work. We're using the tool to deliver what we wanted to achieve anyway, and we're going to do it in a better way or a more effective way. So the resources are likely to be less. That's what we're hoping, because for any given project, we would be assuming that there will be a choice of tools that we can use to deliver. We will use the most effective one. The second issue that came up is that there was a concern about long-term liabilities. Potentially the agreements are in perpetuity, therefore people who are looking at risk want to be confident that those risks can be managed over that time period. Quite difficult. We're still thinking about how that can be done. But to an extent, the risk is probably less than some of the complex workarounds that we're using at the moment, where we're having a whole series of agreements followed by designation. Things can go wrong at each sort of change, and let's say that public money can be put at risk because that sort of intended process can go wrong. Okay, so here's the horrendous bit. Some of the things that we need to do in sort of more detail. We need to have a fairly comprehensive set of guidance documents which will cover the life cycle of a conservation covenant. That's a list of the main ones. I know that when I showed this slide on Tuesday, a lot of the participants saw it as rather daunting. It really isn't as bad as it looks, because we do a lot of those things anyway. It's just putting them together in a different format and tweaking it so that it becomes relevant to conservation covenants. What else do we need to do? We're almost certainly going to have to develop agreement template, perhaps templates. We haven't decided whether one or more than one will be required. We need to look at our financial, non-financial schemes of delegation to include conservation covenants. We need to have a monitoring and evaluation framework. We see that as being incredibly important. We may have to have an alternative IT system, one that's appropriate for agreements which are potentially in perpetuity. Staff training will need to be put in place. It's a new tool. They will have to be able to use it. We need to engage with stakeholders, both external and internal, and we've also got to sort out all the signing off processes and when we sign on how we sign off conservation covenants and how we make changes. So basically, there is quite a lot to do. Still confident that we can meet that 30th of September deadline. And then my last slide was where we're actually going to all that effort. To an extent, I've possibly answered that already, in that we're wanting to be able to do what we already do more effectively. And I thought I would just sort of flag a few reasons for why we might be doing those. At the moment, we're very much focused on nature recovery. Conservation covenants have the potential to secure better long-term outcomes. We don't have that at the moment. Relying on agreements, they tend to be relatively short-term. Long-term outcomes, we can go up to that 100-year, 1,000-year type period. We can safeguard our initial investments. If I'm thinking about something like peatland restoration, often we have very large-scale initial investments for raising water levels. That's when the money goes in right at the start. And then the outcomes that you're wanting are 20, 30 years down the line. It's often the case that those agreements don't last as long as you intended. Changes in circumstances, landowner dies, land is sold, and the outcomes that you want aren't realised. Conservation covenants, by being tied to the land, can lessen that risk. Which takes me on to the next point, reduced risk. We have a single tool available rather than using complex workarounds. frequently we've used multiple agreements, one agreement followed by another, followed by designation once it hits the required standard. In other cases, we have groups of landowners, all with agreements, one drops out and the whole scheme fails. If a conservation covenant applies, then that situation doesn't arise because the benefits you want will be secured regardless of whether the land changes ownership. And then finally, we think that it could provide greater confidence to investors. We're always keen sort of to look for alternative income sources or alternative private sector investors. One of the things that we think is that an investor is going to want to have absolute confidence that what they're buying is going to be delivered. If we think about sort of nature-based solutions, natural flood management, a private investor isn't going to want to put money into a scheme on the day it rains or a week before the landowner had changed, the land had been sold, new landowner wasn't maintaining the scheme and you got floods. They'll want that certainty. Carbon capture and storage would be another one. The schemes really have to be compatible with geological scales that some of the grey infrastructure projects have been talking about. So that gives the investors a choice between a nature-based solution and an alternative type of solution, sort of pumping carbon under the sea, where you're talking about geological timescales. It gives them confidence that, say in 2050, your carbon sink, which is based on peat, isn't going to have turned from a sink into a source. So that certainty, I think, is really important looking for going forward. Sorry, I just think I've finished and moved on to the next slide. Becky, I'll give you control again.
Lovely, thanks Graham, that's great. Okay, so we're moving on to questions. So lots of questions already coming through the chat. As I said before, we'll answer as many of those as we can today. Those we can't, we will add, well, we'll add all the answers anyway to frequently asked questions, which are on the PAS website. That's under our biodiversity net gain pages. But any we can't answer today, we'll take away and add to those as well and get answers from Defra and Natural England on those. I am going to click off the slides now. And if people are happy, I'm going to bring you in to ask the questions. So I think our top question, and I know you asked quite a few, Tom, but it's Tom Childs around enforcement. And so Tom, would you like to ask your question around enforcement and associated costs, the coverage of costs? Do you want to come in and ask that?
Thanks. Yeah, sorry, I wasn't expecting to talk. Yeah, it's just, you know, in some ways it sort of replicates some things that we might have in an S106 or something like that. And is a conservation covenant enforced by the responsible body, who might be a charity, or does it, when it comes down to enforcement, is it going to default back to the council to take out an injunction or step in like that? And how are those costs covered when that enforcement actually comes about, if needed?
Brilliant, thanks Tom. Shall I come to you first, Freya?
Yeah, absolutely. But I'm sure Tom Reynolds can comment particularly on BMG as well. Yeah, so essentially the duty is on the responsible body to enforce the contents of that agreement. And unless the local authority is the responsible body, they probably wouldn't go dabbling in these agreements because, for one thing, they are private. So though for agreements like BMG, you'll be uploading or sharing some of the contents of those agreements to demonstrate that, you know, you're actually going to deliver this. For other agreements, particularly if they're kind of altruistic, they're private and they won't be available just to simply view as a random member of the public. They could be made available if the parties wanted to, but there's no duty to share it publicly because it's that private agreement. So in terms of enforcement, it would be a requirement of all responsible bodies to have a kind of process in place for the resolution of any disputes which arose. And if the landowner and the responsible body after going through this process, still cannot decide, still there are areas of difficulty and disagreement. What you can do, and what we're doing at the moment, is making possible with the Ministry of Justice, is you could go to the Lands Chamber of the Upper Tribunal and escalate a dispute to that point. Now, we would estimate that it's probably going to be a smaller proportion of agreements and disagreements that would actually make it to that point, as obviously there'd be considerable kind of time and financial costs involved in that. But that really would kind of be a last resort. And if there are points where a responsible body is not fulfilling the requirements that we've laid out for them, we do also in Defra have the power to de-designate that responsible body. So if it did happen, for example, that a court ruled that actually the responsible body was at fault, they hadn't correctly played their part or their role in delivering this agreement, we could have the powers to strip that organisation of the status of responsible body and thereby ban them from entering into conservation covenants in future. But in terms of providing funding for that enforcement, we would expect any funds estimated to be required by either party to come simply from those parties' funds. There won't be a kind of central government pot which could be dipped into for policing. But that's why it's really important we get the responsible body designation process right as well. We want to make sure that the right kinds of organisations are getting involved.
Thank you. Cheers.
Tom, I don't know if you wanted to add anything relevant to BNG there, or if you're right.
Becky was trying to come in there.
I was, and I forgot to unmute myself. Yeah, I was going to say, Tom, do you want to come in on BNG? I think one of the questions that came up on Tuesday was around how this fits with the new burdens as well. I don't know, that may not be something you can cover, but just in terms of that side of BNG and the funding for that. So yeah.
Yeah, so as Freya said, I think it's important that responsible bodies, there's going to be a cost associated with it, and those costs should be covered. And we're not dictating the financial arrangements for conservation covenants in general, or for biodiversity net gain ones either. There are various new costs that are going to come about for biodiversity net gain, such as creating habitats, managing habitats, monitoring, and also enforcement of those covenants. And I think it is important to ensure success that all those costs are covered by the system. There is new burdens funding coming for local authorities. I think some has gone out already. I don't recall the exact amount, but that's for kind of the role as part of the planning process. That's different from responsible body role. The two things are separate.
Keep forgetting to unmute myself. Sorry, Graham, would you like to come in?
Thanks, Becky. I was just going to say that one of the points on the slide, on my slide, was in terms of the guidance, was including something about addressing disputes. So we've got to work out how we're going to address disputes. And my thinking at the moment is that within the conservation covenant template that we'll be developing, we'll be setting out sort of dispute resolution processes which are at a level below taking it to sort of the land tribunal, which is obviously going to be costly. We want to have a process in place which is much, much cheaper, where we can get it resolved before it goes to the court. So that's probably one reason why it's quite important that responsible bodies have their own templates, because each will want to have their own individual dispute resolution procedures, which is appropriate to them.
Brilliant, thanks, Graham. That's really helpful. Okay, Tom, does that answer your question?
I think it does. Yeah, it's obviously quite complex, and there will be sort of links back to the planning system again. As BNG will be, obligation potentially. So yeah, I'll go back to everybody and discuss this more. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks, Tom. Okay, so I'm just going back to some other questions. So probably a few of these I might just ask rather than bringing people in, because they're fairly succinct. So a couple just around what covenants can be used for. So we've got one from Charlotte around, can they be used on a landscape scale, for example, a protected landscape such as a national park? And then Sarah asked if they can be used for sustainable drainage systems. So Freya, do you want to come in first on those two?
Yeah, short answer, yes.
Yes.
As long as it refers, it is kind of conservation, it's, you know, delivering things which are for the public good, such as, you know, sustainable drainage, whilst it might not be kind of typical big showy conservation. Yeah, absolutely, if that's kind of conservation of the natural environment and it's providing this public good, yeah, I don't think that would be controversial.
Brilliant. And just a couple more I'm picking up around that. So there's Glenn asked around whether they can be used to encourage private landowners to commit to contributing to increasing local tree canopy cover to help reduce residual CO2. I'm guessing the answer would be yes, but they can't be sort of used to force them to do that, but it's because it's a voluntary agreement.
Yeah, so you choose to enter into an agreement, and absolutely entering into that might be incentivized by other things like maybe grant schemes that are available to achieve those kinds of local outcomes. So I guess it's important, you could easily, you might actually be eligible for kind of multiple schemes trying to achieve multiple objectives and deliver that through conservation covenants. So all you'd have to do is, if you are looking to achieve those kind of objectives, is make sure that things like biodiversity net gain, there are limits in terms of like what benefits you can kind of stack. You might not necessarily be able to claim for all of these multiple things at the same point in time. So it's simply a way of delivering those objectives, and you'd want to check with each individual scheme that the way you're using your conservation covenant is eligible for that scheme.
Brilliant. Yeah, and I think one of the points that sort of came up on Tuesday was very much this is a tool to deliver a wide range of different things. So think of it like that. So it's less a question of well, it obviously is about what it can deliver, but it can be used as a tool, and it's got a lot of flexibility there. So I'm guessing the answer to Charlotte's question around whether it can apply to freshwater and coastal habitats is the same. Is there any limit in terms of, does it only go down to mean low water or anything like that? I don't know.
Yes, that is actually a question that has come up before, and we've clarified with legal. Basically, because they have to be registered as a local land charge, you can only create a conservation covenant on anything that extends up to kind of that technical definition of land. Yeah, anything that is, you know, fully subterranean, unfortunately, is out of scope for these.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Freya. Okay, so we've got just a question sort of following up on that previous enforcement question around the what safeguards there are if a private responsible body fails. And I think also there's a question here around, have other countries that have a similar system to conservation covenants allowed private bodies to be private companies to be responsible bodies? So again, can I come to you first, Freya?
Sure. So for private bodies, and in fact any responsible body that happened to fail, in all instances, the conservation covenants to which that body is signed up to, they would automatically go to the Secretary of State. So that's the Secretary of State for Defra, who would be kind of temporarily responsible for looking after those agreements. This isn't a long-term solution, clearly, and the aim there would be to identify at pace another appropriate responsible body that would be kind of ready and willing to take on those agreements. And we're also kind of in discussion, nothing firm, about what we can do in perhaps a financial sense to ensure that the funds required are in place to facilitate that transition if it needed to happen.
Brilliant, thanks, Freya. Okay, right, I'll move on. So yeah, just a few more sort of practical questions around the coverage and scope. So there's a couple here around the length of time that you secure you can secure a site through the conservation covenant. So there's one around the definition of use for perpetuity, sorry, that's a bit difficult one, and whether it reflects the Perpetuity and Accumulations Act of 125 years, or is it genuinely indefinite? There's also a question around the nutrient trading platform, which is a platform that is running in the Solent for nutrient neutrality, and the fact that under nutrient neutrality, which is a habitats regulations requirement, you're securing sites for 80 to 100 years, but how that works in terms of biodiversity net gain, which is only for 30 years, and how those timeframes are aligned. So maybe if I come to you, Freya, sort of more generally, perhaps on the timescales, and then I don't know if Tom might want to come in, and maybe even Roy, actually, from the PAS team around the sort of nutrient neutrality BNG angle.
Sure. So in terms of in perpetuity, need to cross-check that with our legal team, but it is closer to that sort of indefinite definition than 125 years. And, you know, you could set a conservation covenant longer than that time period too. I can't come back with an exact figure for you, but it's a long time. And I'll double check that with our team.
Lovely, thanks, Freya, that's great.
Sure. And quickly, in terms of those timelines for BNG and nutrient neutrality, from a concourse perspective, as an overview, if you wanted to kind of use land for both of those purposes, it might well be involved in both of those purposes. You could have either two separate agreements, or you could have a conservation covenant which included some different criteria and different uses of the land subject to certain conditions or different points in time. So it would be possible. Obviously, it gets more complex the more different details and different schemes you have in there. But any lawyer working with you on getting up a contract should be able to kind of walk you through that process.
Brilliant, lovely. Did you want to add anything, Tom, on that?
I was just going to say, yeah, for BNG, 30 years is the minimum, but they could be longer, or they don't have to be longer. And on the difference in timelines between nutrients and BNG, it is being discussed internally if they can be aligned or should be aligned in some way. So watch this space. Thanks.
Brilliant. Roy, did you want to come in at all? And it's fine if you don't. I know, because that's something that's sort of been coming up through the workshops we've been running on nutrient neutrality as well.
Yeah, I think the two previous folk have answered that question probably as well as I could at the moment. But yeah, it's obviously it's an issue, practical issue.
Brilliant. Charlotte, was there anything else you wanted to? Does that answer it? I guess as well as we can at the moment, or was there anything you wanted to add on that?
No, I do think it answers it at this point in time. Although I have to confess, I'm a little bit confused with the various different timelines in terms of nutrient neutrality, BNG, local plans, conservation covenants, you know, water company planning. We're all, as a general rule, we're all working to different timelines out, and it doesn't make for a very integrated approach. That's just a general point. But whilst I'm on, I just wanted to understand, and I apologise if I'm being really stupid here, but in Natural England suggesting that they're going to be the responsible body for the whole country.
Yeah, that's a good one to answer. Graham, do you want to ask that? Because we came onto that on Tuesday as well, didn't we? Because there were some questions on Tuesday around what if you don't have a responsible body locally, if the LPA doesn't do it, you know, and there's no charities that are doing it, would any perhaps step in? So yeah, do you want to come in on that, Graham?
We're working on the basis that when we apply, we will be a responsible body able to enter into conservation covenants across the whole of England. That doesn't mean that we would take them. We still have to go through sort of all our other processes. Can I pick up on the other point you made about timelines, Charlotte? I see conservation covenants as a tool, and the timeline is from, let's call it 0 years up to in perpetuity. All the other things you mentioned were policy areas, which means that conservation covenants can be used for those. You just adjust the timeline of your conservation covenant so it's appropriate to that particular policy area, whether it's nutrient neutrality, biodiversity net gain, or whatever.
Yeah, I guess it comes down to the practicalities and the process, because, you know, this is all going to be wrapped up in legal in terms of legal contracts and legal jargon. So I don't know how practical that will be because I'm not a local authority. But the other thing, just following on from the point about Natural England being a responsible body. So do I take it then possibly be a responsible body that you'd have to take the enforcement if the covenant was breached, but you'd be an advisor as well? Is that how it would work?
What do you mean by advisor as well?
What in terms of your kind of responsibility as a Natural England now, as in the advice you give?
We would hope the two wouldn't conflict. I'll have to get back to you. Do you mean in terms of advice on the environmental designations?
Well, there's there's planning. You've got your own planning advice, haven't you? You've got
Yes.
Habitats regulations and all of the sort of statutory kind of responsibilities of Natural England. I'm just wondering how the two would sit together. That's all.
Okay, we've got to tie that together so we use them in a way that's compatible with all our other obligations.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine I used to work for Natural England, and there's a lot of, and it'll be the same in a local authority. You have a lot of different responsibilities, and you've got to stack those up. I know in terms of wildlife licensing, there have to be some separation sometimes in terms of the advice at planning stage versus wildlife licensing, for example. So I would imagine that's covered. But we can take that one away, Charlotte. Just to come back to your point, Charlotte, around all of these different policy areas and how they all stack up. And there's obviously the timelines issues, but there's just this general issue around stacking and how you do that. In PAS, we've got this BNG project. We've also got a nutrient neutrality project, but we are really trying to look at this sort of in the round and sort of highlight these issues and bring it all together for a local authority in a place and try and get that understanding as much as we can. So we don't necessarily have the answers, but we're definitely sort of trying to push to get that, understood, because it's really going to be key to understand how these things all stack to get up and how they work to deliver, better for the environment in a place. So
Yes,
just watch this space on that one.
From an Environment Agency point of view, we obviously work in terms of flood risk. We work to different timescales as well. So that's just another consideration.
Okay, brilliant. All right. Okay, so we're going to move on. Okay, so I'm just looking through. So I think we've had a few questions around timelines and things, but I think we've probably covered those. And we covered that one. I'm just okay, so we've just got a few questions around the local authority role in planning. When can a local authority apply to be a responsible body? Do you want to answer that one quickly, Freya? Actually, we'll maybe do that. Oh, actually, we'll do these two together. When can a local authority apply to be a responsible body? And also, could a parish council or neighbourhood planning steering group apply to be a responsible body?
So when can you apply? I think Graham covered briefly, but yeah, just to clarify, if you were able to designate from 30th September, there is a possibility you might be able to apply to be a responsible body earlier. Depends on the application process we get up and running. I would probably treat day one as that 30th September and go from there. And yeah, there will be applications on a rolling basis. So it is an area where we're expecting demand to be increasing in coming years, particularly the next couple of years. So yeah, we want to leave it open to plenty of new companies, organisations to apply, and there will be no close date. And then what was the second question, sorry?
It was whether a parish council or neighbourhood planning steering group could apply to be a responsible body. I
think, so what you need to be a responsible body is you need to fill in part of the form that has, an organisation's registered number, either as a private company or as a charitable organisation or something. So that organisation needs to be a kind of legal entity of some kind that are listed above. So I think if a group were registered as a public body, and you could point to that organisation as, this is the entity, this is what it means, we have dedicated financial records, and so on, then if it had the right expertise and the right intent, then yes, you would just have to make sure that it was a kind of a sufficiently formal group to be signing on to that kind of agreement, if that makes sense.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. Neil Butler, are you around to perhaps ask your question around supporting net gain evidence during the planning application? It might be easier if you answer that one rather than I try to.
Yeah, I'll boil it down really. I thought the conservation covenants would be used to sort of replace Section 106 in a way for net gain, but it seems that you're saying that, also it was said earlier, that you'd have the planning obligation and then you'd have the conservation covenant. So it's proposed to sort of do both, is it?
And I know we've actually got a couple of other questions around this, actually, the sort of Section 106. So I know Laura asked that we've already got Section 106s. They are attached to the land, they're legally enforceably, they can be any number of years, but also available to viewing by the public. So are they potentially more transparent? And I think we had, another question from Sue as well around that sort of role. You know, is it going to be mostly through conservation covenants or through Section 106, and what are the benefits and disbenefits of both? I don't know, Tom, how much you can sort of pick those ones up.
Yeah, sure, happy to. Thanks, Becky. I'll take Neil's one first, if that's all right. So the Environment Act says that they have to have off-site secured by covenant before the game plan is approved, but that can be attached to planning permission as a condition. So they don't have to have the covenant or an obligation in place to get planning permission. They get their planning permission with the general condition attached, which says before you can start development, you have to submit and have approved your game plan, or words to that effect. Then they go away and find their offsite units, purchase them, make sure they're allocated on the register, purchase credits if they need credits from government, and then they'd submit their final game plan to the local authority for approval. So that's kind of the sequence of events, and that means that they don't have to have that legal agreement in place before they get planning permission. In terms of the difference between obligations or covenants, I think it is either or. It's not both, hopefully. So
that's what I thought. So you can submit the conservation covenant as a satisfying your pre-commencement condition, basically.
So the covenant is slightly separate from the planning. So planning obligations are related to a planning application, in my experience, although I'm no expert. Yeah. Conservation covenants are kind of an entirely separate and standalone thing. So you can have a covenant on land that secures habitat creation and enhancement, which creates biodiversity units, and it's registered, and that is there and exists. Separately, you'll have some sort of contract between a developer and the provider of those units for purchase of the units. And then those units can be allocated to that development on our national register, which is being developed. And that gives local authority peace of mind that, okay, this development has a shortfall of 10 units. I can look on the register and see that those units are being provided by, and I know that it's secured by a covenant because it has to be registered on the register. And at that point, you've kind of got peace of mind. So there shouldn't be kind of too much of a link between the conservation covenant and the planning process itself, other than at the game plan approval stage. And I think that the benefit, and we've had the question before, we hear it a lot, what's the difference between the two, and why do we care about covenants, or why should we? And for me, it comes down to getting a head start on mitigating the impact of development. So habitat banking, you've probably heard the term. If we can encourage offsetting to start now before development's happening, or as early as we can, and get those units secured for 30 years, then when development does happen, A, the impact have already started to be offset, which is a good thing. B, it streamlines the process for developers because they've got a bank of units they can go to buy, rather than having to panic and think about, oh no, I haven't got any units, I need to find some, where can I get them from? So there's kind of multiple reasons really that conservation covenants give us all that flexibility to start that market now in advance of planning applications. The alternative is, I think, that you get a planning application, they don't know where the units are going to be, they haven't got any, there's no covenants and there's no market, and now they're going, okay, what do we do, how do we get this development through? And at that point they might have to create a planning obligation and do it ad hoc, and that'll slow the process down and make it a bit more difficult. So for me, that's the benefit really of covenants. It's that kind of the foresight and the flexibility that they offer over planning applications. And should add also with the Levelling Up Bill, it's just a bit at this stage, it could change, but we don't know for certain what the future of planning obligations is. And conservation covenants have just been brought into force, and they're a new thing designed for this purpose. So definitely do consider them.
Okay.
Brilliant, thanks, Tom. Does that answer your question, Neil?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Brilliant. So Bateman, did do you think that answers yours as well?
Yes, thank you.
Brilliant. I know that Laura can't talk, so Laura, do put a point in the chat if there was anything else you wanted to add on that point. Okay, so brilliant. Right. What am I doing? Oh, I've clicked onto the wrong screen. Excuse me, just a second. My computer's gone into slow mode, which is really helpful. Okay, so just a question here, sort of around practical scope, from James asking if they could have a national register of conservation covenants and GIS mapped, for example, with Magic, which would help with examples and provide contacts to avoid duplication of effort and similar. I think we had another question which was around whether there'll be sort of lists of conservation covenants, or I'm wondering if, responsible bodies, although I'm now thinking maybe that was from the previous session. But yes, Freya, do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, so we will have a list of responsible bodies, so that'll be published on gov.uk. We will make it clear, you know, which ALBs are responsible bodies, which maybe private organisations are responsible bodies, so that it'll be easier for landowners to kind of have a look and contact someone directly if that's the way you want it to work. And then in terms of kind of having, I guess there's a few different questions there. So we won't be providing templates for standard conservation covenants, kind of particularly basically because there is no clear standard, because they can be used in such a diversity of ways. So we think we could get into tying ourselves in some complex legal knots and kind of giving some frameworks that probably won't be applicable to all of those ways in which they'll be used. However, we are exploring for specific schemes such as BNG, potentially whether a sort of framework might be useful. So that legal market of the development of those contracts and what they can include. We're aware this market is already developing. We'd actually been contacted by quite a lot of independent organisations who are looking to get their legal teams up and running and well versed in this kind of thing. So as I mentioned, we're publishing our guidance in July, the first set, and then we'll have some more coming out more in the direct lead up to their release. And that should make it clear and more kind of publicly available what the requirements of being a responsible body and of the conservation covenant agreement are itself. So you'll have that guidance. We won't be providing frameworks or training directly, but I suppose as with BNG, that kind of market for that use is essentially developing at present. And then in terms of logs of conservation covenants themselves, so many questions in this one. For the areas, because it has to be registered as a local land charge, if you're in an authority that's actually doing that, moving to doing that online, you'll obviously be able to see where conservation covenants are registered, and they'll be physically mapped on that digital map in that format. So you will be able to see that. And Tom might want to come on as well and to talking about the register and what that means for ConCovs that are registered for BNG specifically. For our annual reporting, we haven't finalised it. We would like to include that kind of GIS data of conservation covenants in our annual reporting. We're just awaiting kind of feasibility analysis of that. But ideally, we do understand the benefit of that, the benefit of being able to see where in the country they're registered and preferably kind of what they're registered for, particularly as they'll be overlapping with some different schemes run by Defra and otherwise. So yeah, at the moment, can't guarantee that will exist, but it's certainly something we're looking into for ConCovs as a whole. And then Tom, if want to pass you for anything to add on BNG.
Yeah, I don't think so. Just I need to say that conservation covenants are a private agreement, so there's no one's forcing them to be made public. However, it's a prerequisite to registering on the biodiversity gain register where they're used for biodiversity net gain. And so the register operator will need to see them to check that certain criteria are met as part of that process. So just to be aware of that distinction.
Okay, brilliant. So sort of the question came from James Bissett, the original one, but I know that Tom Charles has also asked one around the sort of local land charge point and the fact that it will then as a local land charge. It will appear on title deeds and searches and about the database online. Tom and James, does that kind of what's been said answer your question? Did you want to come in and clarify any of that or add anything further to those questions?
No, I think that's very good, thank you. It gives us a good idea. I think certainly depending on how local land charges goes, actually being able to see the areas registered and possibly the length of the agreement and why the agreement is in place would be really, really useful to lots of people and save a lot of other questions and things being asked. I appreciate that they're obviously a private, you might not want the whole legal document available, but just some outlines on it would be a really useful set of data. And I know people are really starting to get to grips with using Magic now, including the public. So obviously that would seem to be a fairly logical place to make them available, if you like, to the wider public, if that would be possible in the future.
Just to comment quickly on that as a point of clarity, when registered on the local land charge, the kind of information you'll definitely be able to see online is very basic because they are that private agreement. So you'll be able to see if this area of land is covered by a conservation covenant, but you won't necessarily be able to see detail on how long that concof is for or the agreement itself. And it absolutely could be uploaded if the parties were minded to do that. But I think, and I agree, it could be useful for a lot of purposes, but yeah, just because they are private agreements, you won't necessarily be able to access data on that level.
So is that something that could actually go in the guidance, that it's strongly recommended that the information is made available publicly as part of the agreement? So almost, if you like, your sort of default is they will go public unless you say otherwise in the agreement?
I think we need to seek legal guidance on that because their status as private agreements is laid out in the Environment Act. We need to see what kind of interpretation of that we could make, but that's one we could take away.
Because that would also then clarify things like FOI and EIR requirements on things like local authorities, as well as to what level we might need to make public if we get inquiries.
Do you mean inquiries as to the kinds of conservation covenants you have in your local authority area? Yeah,
or even about specific ones, so we know what level of detail we can actually make available through that. I think generally you wouldn't have access to that information, so you wouldn't be able to answer anything complex. Yeah, unless you're party to the agreement itself. And obviously, if you are party to the agreement, that might be subject to certain kind of confidentiality clauses. So that would depend on kind of each individual contract, what was built in terms of what you could say on FOIs. But I'll certainly bring the sort of what data we should recommend could be shared. I'll bring that question to our legal advisors. Great, thank you.
I think that answers my questions too as well. Yeah, as far as FOIs go, if we can just refer to a database, I don't think we want to be able to go through lots of documents and provide lengthy FOIs. That'd be fine too. And I guess some of them will come off the system when the conservation covenant terminates, so it'll be updated, I imagine. Thanks. Cheers.
Brilliant. Thanks, guys. OK, so a couple of points have come up. One from Louise, which actually came up on Tuesday, and we had a bit of a chat around this, around how conservation covenants fit within the planning system regarding BNG and Section 106s. Obviously, Louise recognises that the conservation covenant remit is wider than BNG, but that's probably where they come across first in those agreements. So I know we did talk a bit more about that, and also a point I think made by Richard around obviously understanding local authorities' existing resource constraints and the burdens funding, particularly around enforcement and monitoring. Why should local authorities agree to become a responsible body? And that, definitely came up very strongly on Tuesday, and we had quite a discussion about that. I don't know, Freya or Tom may want to come in on that, and maybe if Tim from Defra is around, because I know he was sort of gave a very good answer to those questions when we talked about it on Tuesday. Should I come to you first, Freya, in case you've got anything to add?
Yeah, I don't know, maybe, yeah, go to Tim, I think.
Yeah.
He's got.
Okay, Tim, are you about? Lovely, thanks, Tim.
I was
put you on the spot.
I was multitasking. Could you repeat the question? I am sorry.
Yeah, it was just coming back to some of the points that came up on Tuesday. So really around why would a local authority become a responsible body? So Richard asks, he can see an advantage for securing long-term woodland cover on private land, as mentioned by a colleague, but beyond that, given the burdens that are already on local authorities and the amount of work they've got. And I know we talked about that around, you know, perhaps some messaging around that, didn't we? And sort of you were going to sort of take that away and think about it. But I think you just gave some very good answers to that when it came up on Tuesday. And there's a slightly separate one around, which I'll probably come to Tom, around sort of flow charts as well. But we did talk again about that on Tuesday, didn't we? About sort of explaining the process in a more practical way and examples and things like that, didn't we? Because part of the issue, I think, was around when you're talking about it in the abstract, it's very difficult to understand what they can be used for. But once you've got some examples, it becomes a bit better. So yeah, I'll hand to you, Tim, and then come to Graham.
No, thank you. And I'm trying to remember what I said on Tuesday. I can't remember saying anything that was that useful. But
I need to replay from our recording, don't I?
The transcript. I mean,
do you want me to step in and start, and Tim has a bit longer?
Yeah, well, I was gonna mention, you know, the NERC duty and the strength of duty, but you kick off, Graham, if you've got something right to hand.
Okay, what I was thinking was, why should LAs want to become a responsible body? The point was made about all the burdens coming on local authorities. Yes, there are, but conservation covenants are a tool which can help you deal with those burdens. There's a lot of emphasis at the moment on placemaking. Local authorities are engaged with that. Conservation covenants could help you with delivering on placemaking. If you think about sort of levelling up, working in towns, some of that is focused on improving infrastructure. It's linked to the land. You could use conservation covenants to safeguard your investments in small parks, improving green space, delivering on sort of green infrastructure standards. You have a huge range of activities which are linked to the land. You may find that using a conservation covenant is a better way of doing what you want to do rather than the way that you're doing it at the moment. So you actually save money rather than it being an additional burden.
Lovely, thanks, Graham. Tim, did you want to add anything to that?
No, and I think maybe it was Graham who gave that excellent answer on Tuesday, not me, but it must have been me. But I think, therefore, you know, under the strength and duty under the Act, and when it comes to considering what action you need to take and then reporting on the actions you've delivered or through the reporting cycle, that conservation covenants might be a really helpful tool in demonstrating how you've secured that enhancement of biodiversity. Otherwise, no, I've got nothing else to add, really. Thanks, Becky.
Brilliant. I'll bring Tom in.
Thanks, Becky. Yeah, I was just going to ask, you know, how, I guess, if we're saying, you know, rather than new burdens of using covenants, we'll keep using planning obligations, but surely that comes with burdens as well, right? So there's legal advice involved and time, and I don't know to what extent, I genuinely don't know to what extent your costs are covered in that process. But conservation covenants can contain financial provisions that are ancillary to the main covenant, and biodiversity net gain, you know, there's no fixed price for that. Hopefully all the costs associated with that process will be factored into the sale of units. And so for me, I think conservation covenants represents an opportunity to actually cover the costs that historically haven't been covered by some of the things that you're doing anyway. You're just going to do it differently, as Graham said. And one further point was that we've heard concerns from some stakeholders about the enforceability of planning obligations, the public interest test and resources. And again, those are hurdles that can be bypassed with conservation covenants. So there's a few reasons to my mind.
Thanks, Tom. Oh, God, sorry. I'm struggling to unmute myself. Freya, did you want to come in quickly, or are you?
I think Tom covered it, but I suppose, yeah, just linking to this, you know, hopefully you won't be out of pocket through this, and we're expecting markets to develop in a way that is appropriate to kind of what we're considering the value of land to be, what we're considering the value of developments to be. I know some questions came forward earlier. I saw one on kind of, you know, how is the developer actually involved in these agreements? Maybe to clarify that, you know, developer, unless it's a landowner or the responsible body, wouldn't be a direct signatory of these agreements, but there'd be maybe a separate contract that that developer would sign, indicating a transfer of funds at the agreed level over the agreed duration to the appropriate landowner and responsible body. And we'd want those funds to be worked out kind of at a level which then would support that agreement, both for the kind of setup of that agreement and its maintenance going forward.
Brilliant, thanks, Freya. Okay, so just some, I think some questions really around the exactly how this is going to work in terms of the planning system with BNG and Section 106s. And so Louise suggests having a flow chart around that, and Sue asks potentially if there might be actually be so she can see the benefit of using a conservation covenant instead of a 106, but that there may actually be a conflict in terms of being responsible body. Tom, I guess it might be useful to know, and obviously understand if you need to take this away, but you know, whether that's something that might be coming through the BNG guidance that will be sort of following anyway around, you know, how these things might map out through the planning process.
Yeah, thanks, Becky. So, we did cover earlier on kind of the different roles for a local authority, and indeed you could be a landowner. A local authorities own a lot of land, and they could be the landowner in the covenant, so the ones delivering biodiversity units and carry through their positive obligations with a different responsible body, but they can't be both in the same agreement, remember. So there's kind of the two facets to this. There's the ability to deliver units on your own land for by being a landowner, as ability to have some sort of control and oversight over delivery in other places by being a responsible body, if you choose to.
Brilliant, thank you. So I think what I was going to say was just sort of, there's Louise's question about the sort of flow chart. We also had a point from Chris Wilson around a workflow for BMG implementation more generally within local authorities. So I think just to say, Chris, Gareth and I are working on website updates right at the moment, the PAS website. And one of the things we're looking at is the journey to biodiversity net gain for local authorities. And that's really thinking about what you can start doing now, what you can start thinking about. At the moment, it doesn't go specifically into the conservation covenants, but it very much thinks around that. I will put a link in the chat to our sort of new front page on that, which starts talking about that, but we'll be adding more content over the next few weeks. So please watch this space, because more will be coming out very soon. And we are very open to feedback on that. So once we get stuff up, if it's not answering your questions and not meeting your needs, then, you know, come back to me, because we want to do that. And if you're interested, we've got an advisory group for the project, but we're sort of reconvening that and getting a bit more of a network around BNG going as well. So please do get in touch with me again if you're interested in that group. Sort of on the point Louise makes, I think we could definitely consider, you know, around that and working with the Defra and NE teams around that sort of process in a bit more detail as well as part of that work, because we've sort of got broad resources, but then we're going to have a real focus on, you know, resources for policy planners, resources for DM, and resources for councillors as well, or for officers to use when talking to councillors. So yeah, so please, yeah, so hopefully there'll be more coming there will be more coming very soon, but hopefully it'll be useful to you is what I was going to say. Okay, so I'm just double checking where we are with questions. Sorry, my computer's decided to be. Oh, yeah. So Neil just asks, so what I guess in terms of, so we're talking about what we can be doing now in terms of BNG, but in a wider sense, is there any existing guidance that you could point to prior to the release of guidance in July? So is there anything that local authorities could be doing now in terms of conservation covenants, I guess, to get ready? Freya.
Yeah, hard to say. I'd probably just hang on and wait for our main guidance in July. It will be less, I'd say less detailed than what you will have got out of this seminar. Just, you know, it's got to be readable, it's got to have the basics in there. So yeah, probably nothing we can point you towards right now, I'm afraid, beyond that. But I know, as we discussed, maybe working up some kind of Q&A, talking with Beck on that. So yeah, watch this space. You will be prepared in time. That September 30th date is obviously the earliest point you can apply to be a responsible body. But it might be worth, I would say, beyond kind of specific actions, maybe thinking about things which are like organisation specific for you. So bringing back this understanding of what ConCos can be used for, what you see as the pros and cons of entering into them as a responsible body versus as a landowner, and perhaps having a bit of a chat with your organisation about what direction you want to go in. Like, as you can see, Graham, I know you got your hand up, in Natural England, they made that decision kind of summer last year, and from that point have then been working on that implementation. So actually trying to work out your stance on conservation covenants and whether you want to be entering into them as an RB, as a landowner, or actually as both. I feel like that's probably the most useful thing you could be looking to do in the immediate future before more guidance on exactly how you do that comes out.
Brilliant, thanks, Freya. Graham, I'll come to you as well, but I note that we've also got a specific question for you around, are you able to give any indication of the resource that's gone in from Natural England in preparing to become a responsible body? You know, maybe the number of staff, the time, legal advice, etc. So I guess that's a bit of both there. It's saying what are you doing already, but also have you got an idea of how much time that's taken?
Okay, I'll go to the original question first of all. What could local authorities do at the moment? I was hoping that my presentation sort of outlined some of the things that you could be doing. I would start thinking about all the things that I highlighted, how you would deal with them, just that general thinking. I think that would be very helpful, and it will probably help you to make the decision, make a decision whether you actually want to apply to become the responsible body. In terms of how much resource Natural England's put in, difficult one to respond. I work 0.5 FTE on conservation covenants, but not all of my role is in terms of setting up the internal processes. Initially, my role on conservation covenants was supporting Defra in terms of introducing the legislation, which is part of sort of the bread and butter of my work. Sort of, I work in strategy and government advice. I advise Defra, so I'm Defra facing. We now have a project manager in place that started since April. That's also at 0.5, and we're anticipating that we will probably need another full-time equivalent over the next sort of 6 months to take it forward. But then that will come back down again because the delivery will go to people who are already working on the projects who have been trained up to use conservation covenants. So overall, we don't see it as being a huge increase in resource because we're delivering what we already want to do. So let's say at the moment it's probably a 1.5 full-time equivalents over the year, and that will possibly come down.
Brilliant, thanks, John. Not John, what am I talking about, Graham? It's because I'm looking at an answer from somebody else called John. Trying to multitask. Lovely, thanks, Graham. Okay, so just double checking where we are. Yeah, so just just a couple that are sort of loosely related around. One from Joe asking about if there are numerous responsible bodies in a local authority area, how would the local authority decide which to use? And then Tom asks, is there a risk that if the burden for costs for responsible bodies are picked up in biodiversity net gain costs or conservation covenant financial provisions, that the responsible body offering service cheapest may be favoured over a responsible body with, for example, better expertise in grassland restoration? So that's quite an interesting one. So yeah, I guess where you've got several, how would you decide? And then also, are there some risks? And I know there were a couple of questions that came up actually around sort of private companies and some risks around the use of private companies. So I know that can't remember who it was in the chat, asked specifically, you know, raising the issue that local authorities already face around management bodies managing land, management companies, and that they're not great. And is there a risk therefore around private companies? So I guess they're different questions, but there's a sort of broad thing around, if you've got several different responsible bodies, how do you decide between them, and are there some risks around some of those models? Shall I come to you first, Freya?
Yeah, sure. Really good questions. I think things that probably affect any sort of indirectly regulated market. There are going to be providers who are offering services with more experience, less experience, at a lower cost, at a higher cost. And yeah, it will just be a kind of case by case decision that a local authority would have to make about who's most suitable out of that list of responsible bodies found on gov.uk for their purposes. So I might suggest you'd probably start by reaching out and contacting a range of responsible bodies that you might feel would be appropriate in your area, and then from the ones which had capacity, had availability, were experienced in the kind of habitat that you're looking at protecting, creating, restoring, that you select from that list. We're not kind of having any sort of tiered set of responsible bodies beyond which, beyond laying out which ones have said that they are that they will be entering into conservation covenants for BNG. So we will kind of at the point of applying to be a responsible body. For example, there might be some organisations which actually, for example, the National Trust might want to be a responsible body, but purely their expertise would really kind of centre around the heritage sector. So they might say, I want to sign out to be a responsible body, but not a responsible body for BNG. So we'll probably have a separate list, kind of one page, RBs that are registered for everything for BNG or perhaps just for heritage, that kind of thing. But beyond those clarifications, we're not going to be kind of ranking RBs. We won't have kind of gold standard and second tier organisations. Everything on there will have passed that initial kind of screening. So yeah, I don't know if there's anything else anyone wants to add on that, but basically quite an individual decision.
Thanks, Freya. Does anyone else want to come in on that one?
One more thing I could add, actually, which I was just thinking of before, is you could also consider, in terms of your priorities for areas, if you are getting involved directly in contracts as a local authority, things like local nature recovery strategies, and where it's particularly useful, of like strategic significance, or particularly useful for that strategy, for example, for a particularly valuable local species or local habitat, to be supporting that kind of species or habitat. So, for example, if part of that aim were looking at bird species, RSPB might look to be a particularly suitable responsible body. So that might be something you'd also want to consider.
Great, thanks. Tom, do you want to come in?
Thanks, Becky. I was going to come in on the question about management companies on site, and I can see Joe Barnes in there about whether conservation covenants be the best way to manage on-site gains. I think the management company one, I think the conservation covenants are a solution there potentially rather than the problem. So if significant on-site gains are secured by a covenant by the developer passes the sales of lands to a management company, they're then bound by the covenant, which is enforceable by the responsible body. So there's a clear enforcement route there, which may be lacking at the moment, which is causing some of the problems. So I think the management company would be the landowner rather than the responsible body there. And if not, well, there's always going to be a responsible body because there have to be for those significant areas. So unless it's a planning obligation used instead. And to Joe's question about whether conservation covenants is the best way to secure on-site. So unlike off-site, on-site can be secured by planning conditions as well as or instead of planning obligations or conservation covenants. So there's that extra tool. I think just think about the historic use of those and planning obligations and whether kind of what has been achieved or set out to be achieved has been achieved, and whether those are the best fit in these circumstances, and whether conservation covenants might be a better way or a new way to do things that have previously been done in those other ways. So it's kind of not sure really which one's the best, but they were all an option. And I'll just say kind of stay open-minded and consider which one might be best.
Great, thanks, Tom. Okay, so I guess just around the people who aren't, because there were a few people who asked that question around there was Joe just on the off-site gains, but then we also had the question more generally around, and now I'm going back through my questions and I've got in a bit of a muddle. What did anyone want to come back in on those ones around sort of the choice of responsible bodies, where you've got a choice and how you might choose? Just checking in amongst the audience. I'll take that as a no. And just wondering if Emma Granger wanted to come in just quickly to ask her question, which is a sort of follow-up around choosing the responsible body.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks, Freya, for that. I think I do a lot of Section 106 agreements, and we do have a lot of issues in terms of private bodies managing, particularly things like public open space. So I think it's just about my nervousness is that if we've got private companies being set up to be responsible bodies, how they are, obviously there is some control over them, but we're looking in terms of biodiversity net gain. We need them up and running for at least 30 years to manage these sites. So, and although they might be financially stable now, will they be in 30 years time, and what issues that, what issues arise there for the local planning authority if they've been trying to achieve biodiversity net gain on large sites. And I think that you did, thank you, Freya, said, talk about how we would choose a responsible body, but I think there was just a question over, do we then have, do the LPA, are they able to choose which responsible body a developer uses?
Yeah, Tom, do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, sure, will do. Doors just got to the dog's barking. Apologies if you can hear that. I think the conservation covenant will probably already be in place, or as kind of a separate process to the planning application. And so I wouldn't say that the local authority necessarily has the choice over which responsible body is chosen. And also remember, the developer is separate to the conservation covenant. They're not part of that agreement. It's between the landowner and the responsible body. But I think I would encourage habitat banks or people looking to set up themselves, private companies that might enter that space to sell biodiversity units to developers. I'd strongly encourage them to engage with the local planning authority as part of that process, because otherwise they're going to come unstuck when they get to game plan approval stage, when local authority is looking at the game plan and the units and taking a decision on whether to discharge a condition or not. And that'd be quite a late stage for it all to come unfurled. So that would be my advice to local authorities and to kind of habitat banks and responsible bodies.
Great, thanks, Tom. Does that sort of answer your question, Emma?
Yeah, I think so. I think that it'll be interesting to see which private companies are set up, and obviously, presumably, there's going to be a hierarchy of where these conservation covenants will be in terms of biodiversity net gain. So we could give much more weight to sites that will be located close to the development site.
Yeah, I would think so. Tom, did you want to come in? And I guess, like Freya said, to do with the LNRS as well, you could link that in.
Indeed, that's incentivised by the metric as well, Emma. Yes. But closer it gets more units. So, yeah.
Brilliant. Right, I'm going to wrap up the questions there. But I do note that Sarah's just asked a question about a private company folding with the Section 106. God, I'm obsessed with Section 106. With the Secretary of State, this is what I'm trying to say, take on the responsibility. And the answer is yes, isn't it, Freya? Yes. Okay, brilliant. Right, I'm going to wrap up. I'm just going to bring up my slides again. I'm aware that people are sort of running out of time, but it'd be great if you could stay on just for a few more minutes, just so that we can wrap up, just tell you what our next steps are going to be, but also get a bit of feedback from you guys around how yeah, how it's been for you. So I'm just going to run a couple of polls. So we ran these polls earlier on, but they didn't have multiple choices. So I'm just going to run them again. So if you could answer again, that would be brilliant. And you should this time, hopefully, if I fixed it, be able to submit more than one answer on these ones. So let's see if this works this time. And I've got the other one here. Okay, so just a couple there around, do you think it's likely that your authority will enter into agreements, and how you might do that? Might you do that as a landowner, as a responsible body, or no, you don't think that's likely? And also what you see your authority using those for. So hopefully those will work this time. And I'm just going to go back to the presentation if I can get it to work. My computer seems to be being a little bit blippy. So let me just open this, see if I can get that to work. Okay, so we'll just okay. Oh, I think that's worked. Can you see my presentation?
See your calendar.
Oh, you can see my calendar. That's always good. Love it. It's just what I wanted to share. I don't know what my computer is doing. I don't know why it's not showing it. Let me see. This has worked absolutely seamlessly every other time, but of course it's decided not to this time. Let me see again. Right, come on. Slide pack. Right, is that working this time? I realise it's gone back to the first slide. There we go. Right, zip through. Of course. Apologies, everybody. Right. Okay, so we've got those polls. I'll just keep those running. Yeah, just in terms of summing up, as we said, we'll answer any outstanding questions that we couldn't get to today or that we sort of said we'd take away, and add those to our frequently asked questions page. We've got ongoing support on biodiversity net gain going through the PAS project, and I covered a little bit of what we're doing now. Do have a look at our website. If you're interested in further updates, sign up to the PAS bulletin. We put those out there. And if you've got any questions specifically about conservation covenants, then please do email the Defra team on that address there. So that's conservation covenants to conservation.covenants@defra.gov.uk. And I'm going to stop sharing because my computer has gone a bit crazy. So we're just going to have a quick look at those results and those polls. So yes, quite a few people interested in going into conservation covenant agreements, which is great, and also for a range of uses, but the primary one being BNG, as expected. Gareth, would we be able to launch the feedback polls? Oh, we've got those coming up. So yeah, we just love to get a bit of feedback from you about how this has been. Do you feel better informed? And also, did you find these useful? So that would be really great. Yeah, clocked your question there, James, around potentially some more info about heritage assets, particularly. And just some questions, Laura, around the sort of link between planning conditions and conservation covenants and planning permission. I think, yeah, as we said earlier on, I think just getting that in our sort of DM pack, the PAS's DM pack, we'll try and do that and explain that sort of relationship about how they could be. Okay, so I think that's all we are going to cover today. So I just want to thank everybody very much for your time today. Thank you for coming along. And yeah, as I said, do sign up to our bulletin for further updates on the biodiversity net gain project and what we're doing. And we'll let you know when the slides and the recording have gone up on our website. And if I could just ask the presenters to just stay on and we'll have a little bit of a wrap up, that would be brilliant, and I will stop recording. Thanks very much, everybody, and have a good rest of your day.